We're here with Bond royalty, a very esteemed guest, John Glen, and this is Johnny.
Hi.
So yeah, we'd like to ask John a few questions about his career in Bond. 5 films. We're not sure if that will ever be matched. So, John, what's if you could pick one scene that showcases your skills out of the Bond films that you directed? What would you pick to say this is what John Glen's all about, or a sequence?
Well, strangely enough, I think it was a film that Lewis Gilbert directed when I did the second unit on. It was The Spy Who Loved Me. And of course, that's the ski parachute sequence where the Union Jack reveals Bond escaping from the jaws of death, shall we say. And that was Cubby Broccoli's favourite sequence scene. And that was my most successful action scene, I think. Okay. I went out to Mount Asgard in the Canadian frozen north, a very difficult location, and Rick Sylvester was the stuntman involved, who looked nothing like James Bond. He was about 5'6" and bespectacled and quite studious looking guy, but of course when they're on their own there's nothing to relate to his size. He was well proportioned, and therefore when we dressed him up in the proper wardrobe he passed the Bond very well. But he was an amazing stuntman, and he called himself a ski bum, really. He used to do the stuff for fun, you know, jumping off mountains and things. And he showed me some footage that was shot in the Yosemite National Park, and he leapt off this mountain top, and he went down like a sack of potatoes. He looked awful. And when I questioned him, he said, "Oh no, if I had the right facilities and a helicopter to get us to the top of Mount Asgard," he said, "and bring my own mountaineers and that," he said, "I'm sure I could do it to your satisfaction." So it's what we did. But with 3 weeks and $250,000 later, we actually managed to achieve that sequence.
Yeah, of the 5 films that you did, which one would you say you're most proud of as a sort of finished product?
Finished product. It's a toss-up between License to Kill, funnily enough, and Octopussy. Octopussy is really my favourite because it had all the things. I love animals, and the circus gave me a perfect opportunity to use animals in the film. Snakes, the girls, to storm the fortress at the end of the film. I used all these acrobats to do various things. And it was novel and it was new. I can't think of any other film that used animals the way we did. And it led to some very amusing incidents. We were filming in India, and the scene called for a tiger to confront Roger when he's in the jungle escaping from the villain, and we couldn't find a tiger anywhere in India. I'm sure there are some, but they're very hard to come by. So I went to one evening we went to the Maharaja's palace for drinks. And when he greeted us in his palace, I looked over behind him and there was a stuffed tiger. So I said to him after the introduction, "Can I borrow your tiger?" And he was quite amused by this, and he said, "Oh, absolutely." So what we did, we put the stuffed tiger in a wheelbarrow and got the prop man to run through the bushes with it, and that sufficed for us to get that part of it with Roger on the location. And the rest we did back at the studio with Jimmy Chipperville, was it? No. Anyway, it was he had several tigers which we brought onto the stage at Pinewood and very carefully shot the rest of the scene with the tiger. But no, it was interesting.
John, you screen tested a few people when Roger was kind of, is he coming back? So you tested Sam Neill, James Brolin, Pierce Brosnan. Who was your favourite? Who was your number one choice to replace Roger?
He was a very difficult act to follow, Roger.
You missed, Mr. Bond. Did I?
You know, it's a big leap to replace him. I quite honestly, I thought that that Timothy was a very good choice, and he was a very fine actor. And he when we'd approached him many years before, I don't think he was quite ready for the role, but now he'd matured a lot, and he was very keen on going back to the original Fleming style, and he had the acting ability to pull it off. So I was very pleased with Timothy, and maybe the subjects we chose, because he had that in his armoury, that acting ability. Maybe the drug, License to Kill, the drug background to the film was very hard, and we had to be true to the story. And it did hurt us a bit at the box office because it was a 15 certificate, if I remember rightly, which excluded the younger children who've been used to Roger Moore stuff.
I want you to know this is nothing personal. It's purely business.
I remember at the golf club one day, one of the members came out to me. He said, "I was cursing you the other day." He said, "I took my young son to see Octopussy." I think the kid was about 10. And he said, and when the octopus, during the fight sequence, latches onto this villain's face during the fight sequence, he said, my boy ducked under the seat and hid his eyes. And afterwards he said, "Dad, would you take me back to see it again, because I really want to see it?" You know. He said, "I had to go and see the film 3 times." He said, before the kid eventually looked at it through his fingertips, you know. So that was good for the box office.
Of the films you didn't direct, which of those did you look to for inspiration, or are there any that are personal favourites?
Yeah, well, I think the best, some of the early ones with Sean were really good films. I thought From Russia with Love was wonderful, wonderful supporting cast as well. And Guy Hamilton directed Goldfinger beautifully, and I think it was one of Fleming's better books, Goldfinger.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
I remember reading it on holiday years and years ago, and couldn't put the book down. It was, you know, it was such original stuff, and very well directed by Guy Hamilton, who was a bit of a wartime hero himself. So you know, it was some very good stories out there, and of course they had the advantage of having the pick of the Fleming books. But I think From Russia with Love was the big step up from Dr. No.
Yeah.
Because they didn't really realise on Dr. No what they had. I remember Peter Hunt telling me that he and Terence Young were watching the press show in town, the first screening of Dr. No, and the critics in the audience all started laughing, and Terence Young got terribly embarrassed. He couldn't understand why they were laughing, because they were making a straight thriller, and suddenly there's all this humour coming out. And so he left the theatre before it finished.
Spectre?
Spectre. Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, Extortion. The 4 great cornerstones of power, headed by the greatest brains in the world.
And Peter had to ring him in the evening. He said, "Go out and get the papers." They're all raving about this new style of British humour, tongue-in-cheek.
How did it happen?
I think they were on their way to a funeral.
And Terence later said to Peter, "Knowing what we know now, how are we going to reproduce this in the next film?"
So with Roger, he was. There's often been talk about he didn't want to kick the car when he sends Locke to his death, and he was a bit critical of the mine massacre in A View to a Kill. How much convincing did he take to be a bit tougher? Was it a big discussion, or did he go quite easily with it?
Well, Roger, you've got to say, it was an absolute fantastic professional actor. And at the end of the day, he would always, the director is the boss on the film, and you discuss these things with the actors. And I certainly discussed the kicking the car off where Locke is in the car. Roger wanted to use a little dove emblem as a sort of a make weight. He throws it in the car, and that little tiny little thing is enough to send the car over the edge. And I said, no, Roger, you've got to kick this villain. He killed your best friend in Cortina, and I said, you've just got to kick him off. I said, that's what you would do.
You left this with Ferrara, I believe.
And we did don't have an argument about it, but we had a kind of long discussion. And in the end, I said, well, I tell you what, you can throw the tie pin in and kick at the same time. So that's what we did in the end. It was kind of a compromise, but it worked.
Had no head for heights.
Everyone we've spoken to and reading about Roger, everyone seems to love the guy, to get on with him incredibly well. But he does allude in his books to the fact that he didn't always get on that well with Grace Jones during View to a Kill. Could you shed any light on that?
Well, they were in adjoining dressing rooms, and I remember very well she used to play loud music on a ghetto blaster.
Right.
And this used to get on Roger's nerves. And one day he'd had enough, and he stormed into her dressing room, grabbed the ghetto blaster, and tried to destroy it. And they had a sort of a fight, but it was a kind of bit of a fun thing, really. So it was, he was annoyed, but this persistent music going, because that's Grace, she's quite a character.
Someone will take care of you.
Oh, you'll see to that personally, will you?
I found her fine, actually. She was very sort of dominant personality, but she was fun. I got on very well with her. In fact, I used to worry she would chase me around the corridor sometimes. She was quite a character.
Yeah, we've heard some stories. One of the most talked about subjects on For Bond Fans Only is the possibility of a black Bond. Do you think that would be too much of a shift and the public wouldn't welcome it? And also, who do you think should replace Daniel Craig? Have you got anyone in mind who you'd like to do it?
Well, there's no reason why a black person couldn't play the role, the way things are changing anyway in this country. I mean, it wouldn't have been acceptable probably 5 years ago, but now it's become more of a possibility.
Yeah.
It might be the sort of change it needs, I don't know. But I suppose Idris Elba is the name that comes up all the time. Might be getting a bit too old for the
Yeah,
part.
he's kind of 44 now.
Because you've got to think ahead of maybe 3 or 4 films, so you're thinking about 7 or 8 years. I mean, Roger was getting too old, really, in View to a Kill. He was showing you can't stop the clock, can you? And with all the, makeup and everything else, there are times when you can see. And don't forget that when I got my first break on For Your Eyes Only, my first instruction was find a new Bond. And then I went on and did 3 with Roger, thank goodness, because he was such a help to me. I mean, that whole opening scene in For Your Eyes Only, at the graveside of his wife, Teresa, I wrote that scene purely to remind people about the history of Bond, to introduce a new Bond at the graveside. And when Roger got the role, it was such a good sequence, we kept it in. Get the idea in.
It seems that, despite certain obstacles and things getting in the way of the franchise and various problems with studios, that it just seems to keep going. It seems to be like this sort of unstoppable train, and I just wondered what you thought was responsible for the longevity of the series and why it is as successful as it is.
Well, I suppose, in the earliest days of Bond, they used to have these exotic locations in the Caribbean and so forth. And remember, in the 60s, early 60s, people didn't travel like they go on package holidays everywhere. It's fairly something that's developed over the years, and probably Bond has something to do with that, because people would go and see these lovely Caribbean exotic locations and palm trees and beautiful turquoise seas, and it got them out of their everyday lives, the routine. Suddenly there's a bit of escapism here, and you'd go and relax and watch a Bond film, and it's got a magic to it. Particularly, I think, Maurice Binder's sort of opening titles, with the guy getting shot. And John Barry's music, it kind of invokes a feeling of, expectancy, and you're in for an eyeful, something unusual. And of course, the action is everything in a Bond film. I mean, you don't go to watch a Bond film for the dialogue, do you, or the story necessarily? It's just the experience. So that's why I think they'll always be popular. They're not to be taken too seriously, but they're just a bit of escapism. And of course, nowadays we're running out of locations. Where haven't we been? We've been everywhere. Some of the locations have been absolutely fantastic. I mean, I think one of the most interesting ones was Iceland, funnily enough, in View to a Kill. That sequence there with the mobile iceberg. I remember that I think it was Hobbs, Mike, was it, whoever made one of the boating companies on the Thames, made up this iceberg out of fiberglass. I remember going down to Sunbury-on-Thames and doing a trial. Mike came out with his iceberg, and we trialled it on the Thames. It was quite interesting to see all the people who were walking their dead dogs on the bank, looking around to see this motorised iceberg going along. And it wasn't April the 1st.
There's been rumours about Dalton coming back for, it would have been kind of 1992. Talk about robots and Hong Kong, and then going a bit lighter. Do you know much about Dalton's third, the plot or anything?
No, not really. We hadn't got that far. I think there was a kind of there was some litigation going on, with they had all kinds of legal problems, and so there was a kind of a big gap between Dalton's second film, License to Kill, and the new one. I mean, he was signed on. He was signed up to do a third one. And then it was put back, and I think it was probably 3 or 4 years before they made another one. I think it was probably 6 years was it? I know it was a long time. So by that time, all the old guard, if you like, Dick Maybaum, myself, lots of people, writers and technicians, and that, we 6 years down the track, everything changes, so they had to more or less start again. But I was only ever employed picture by picture, so, it was no great surprise to, after a 6-year gap, that they chose someone else, and I think it was a wise choice.
Trust me.
During the mid-80s, obviously there was the Battle of the Bonds, and there was the McCrory rival film Never Say Never Again.
Yeah.
Was there a consciousness on set during Octopussy that there was this sort of rivalry, a sort of rival film being made with Sean? And was that sort of feeding into the work you were doing on Octopussy, or? Strangely
enough, not. We never really had any fear about, people have tried to imitate Bond in the past. Americans tried to do it with our man Flint, and that was a flop. And They had a female Bond, I think they made years ago, and that didn't do very well. No, we weren't worried at all, and we were making Octopussy at that time, and we were fully engaged with doing that, and you know, with all the animals and the circuses and so forth. And in fact, on the Kevin McClory film, Never Say Never Again, they had Sean Connery, which is a great coup, and that's why it was called Never Say Never Again, because he was saying he would never do another Bond. Yeah. And of course, you must never say never again. But he, you know, he was their biggest asset, if you like, with that film. And then, of course, we had Roger, who was well established by now as Bond, so we didn't really have any. In fact, while they were shooting, they sent the labs, the film laboratories got mixed up with the tins of film, and one day into my cutting room came their film, several reels of their rushes, and we didn't open them and look at it or anything. In fact, we paid for the car to take it out to Elstree where they were filming. So we had good relations with them. We didn't, you know, there had been bad feelings, I suppose you might say, between Sean and Cubby. I think Sean, you know, I think he felt he hadn't been paid enough or something. I don't know, but every time we met, Sean would come and have dinner. He'd have lunch when he was doing Outlander. I think we were in the commissary at Pinewood, and Sean came by, and everything was very cordial. And he sat down, and he joined us for lunch. So you know, but all the, you know, you listen to the press, it's good. It's newsworthy, isn't it, to bring a bit of confrontation into it. But yeah, there was. Yeah, they were cordial.
Are there any scenes out of the 5 you directed that you'd go back and reshoot or take out, or you were kind of a no regrets man?
Well, I mean, making a Bond film, it's like it's got a life of its own, in a way. You know, you start off with an idea, you develop it. There's a lot of discussion with the writers and what have you. So it's very difficult to say you do anything differently. I mean, one of the best parts of filmmaking is actually the writing. You know, where you know, when you're actually in on the blank page, and you develop the action sequences, and you go on the records, and you get ideas from what you see, and then you can adapt it to the actual screenplay. No, we had great relations with Michael Wilson and Richard Maybaum, and Cubby would come along. We'd have these script conferences, and they were very amusing. Dick Maybaum always used to write the leading lady as his wife, who was like 70 odd years of age and a very, very attractive woman in her time. And Dick he used to be an actor. He started off as an actor, Richard Maybaum, and he would get down on one knee and make this passionate plea for, you know, a speech that the leading lady was going to make, and it was so funny. We'd have some fits of laughter.
Yeah. Obviously, pre-Bond, you'd already been involved in some massive films. The Italian Job, I believe, Superman. How did you sort of get to Bond? What was your sort of journey?
Well, it all started with Peter Hunt, who was a friend of mine, and we started off in 1946, I think, at Shepperton Studios. He was a junior assistant in the cutting rooms, and I was even junior. And our careers sort of went in different directions. And he became an editor before I did, and then I became an editor, and then he got a chance to work on the Bond films with Terence Young. And he was an amazing editor, Peter. And he introduced a new style of editing. You know, it's a sort of shorthand. You know, a look towards the door, and then you cut out the corridor, and Sean Connery would be walking along the corridor. It was kind of unheard of in those days. So we used to make time. You know, it would just be the important bits that would be portrayed. You know, all the mundane, boring bits would be cut out. And he had this style, this shorthand style of editing, and it works very well on the Bond films. Anyway, he got the chance to direct on Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is probably one of the best books, if not the best book, that Fleming wrote. And he got into a bit of trouble in Switzerland. They had very bad snow conditions. There wasn't any snow, and then it did snow, and then they couldn't move because they had so much snow. And the Bob Run sequence, which was a very important scene in the film, probably the biggest action scene in the film, was melting now. The sun came out, and the ice was melting, and it became dangerous. It was important, imperative to get on and shoot the scene quickly. And Peter was thinking, I'm going to need another director to go out there and direct and he thought of me. He'd been watching my career blossom, if you like, doing TV series like Danger Man and what have you. And he thought of me, and I got a call. I was working on the Italian Job, actually, towards the end of, we were in the dubbing theatre, and I got a call from Pinewood, and they said, oh, would you come over and see Peter Hunt on the set? And Peter Collinson, who was the director of the Italian Job, he said, they're going to give you a job on the new Bond film. I said, I doubt it. He said, I'll ring up Harry Saltzman. So I said, please don't. And he did. He rang Harry Saltzman and gave me a big push, and not that it meant much, but I went over to the studio, and Peter Hunt was directing Diana Rigg and George Lazenby. And he said, I'll be with you in a minute, John. He said, read this sequence. And he opened up the script on the Bob Run sequence, and I read it. And he came over after he'd finished the scene, and he said, what do you think? Would you like to direct it? Of course I said yes, and on the following Monday I was on a plane flying first class to Switzerland, and a whole new career, if you like, on the Bond film. So that's how it started. And I made a big success of the Bond run. We managed to shoot the Bob Run sequence. I had to do it very quickly, and I had to improvise a lot. We would put these big sun sails on all the critical parts of the course to stop the ice melting. We put these shades to keep the sun off it. And I started off by taking the shades down while I was shooting, and then time got so desperate, I said, leave them up. And it made the course look twice as long, because suddenly it was changing, from some had the shades up, some had the shades down, but it worked.
Well, on License, obviously License to Kill was a big shift in tone, and it had to be cut down to be a 15. Were you kind of, obviously you were aware that you was making this shift in tone, were you kind of worried about how that would be perceived and how it'd go down at the box office at the time?
Well, I think in answer to that is I think we were relying on Timothy Dalton's acting to win the day, because it was a good story, and it was coming up in the news all the time now about these drug barons and what have you. We knew there was a bit of a danger, but these sort of violent films were becoming quite popular at the time. Trying to think of some of those films. The Die Hard films were very successful in America and what have you. So we were kind of following that trend. We used to try and keep up with the times, and be topical,
Yeah.
And but there's always a danger, when you change course. You go from something very light and, almost, the villains were almost comic characters, weren't they? And you're suddenly into a real life drama with these ruthless drug barons. And Darby, I thought, was fantastic in that role, because he played it with such humour, and he was a man who one moment would order the death of people, and the next breath he is charming and suave. We tested him actually in Cubby's house. We were testing girls, and we dressed Robert Darby up as James Bond, and he wasn't half bad, I tell you. Yeah, he was good.
So bring this to a close now and bring it up to date. What is your sort of opinion and thoughts on the modern output and the Daniel Craig era?
Yeah, well, as I say, I think the Daniel Craig films are very good and been very successful in America. They seem to have been accepted. That kind of harder-edged film seems to have been accepted now in America, whereas it didn't seem to accept it with Timothy, although the rest of the world seems to have done. And I think License to Kill has become more popular over the years. I think people realise, I mean, the tanker chase is a fantastic action sequence. And the girls in that, Lisa Soto and Carrie Lowell, beautiful girls. And we shot it in Mexico, which was, was pretty hard going at times, you can imagine. Just after the earthquake they had there. I mean, when we first went there on the recce to Mexico City, the skyscrapers were leaning against each other. They were all condemned, and it was very difficult. Cherubisco Studios, where we shot it, was falling apart. The first explosion on the set, all the lining in the ceiling came down like autumn leaves while we were filming. But it was a terrific experience, and Mexico, they're pretty good filmmakers there. They make some good films, and they've got some very good actors. So my experience was very good there, really. As I say, there's a lot of corruption. We had an instance where we needed guns for one of the scenes, and we had to bring them in from Los Angeles, and they got through US Customs fine. When we got to the Mexican end of the customs shed, and they said, no, we're not allowing these guns into the country unless you pay us $50,000. Corruption, you see. And Tom Pevsner, who was the producer, associate producer, he said, I'm not paying it. And they said, if you don't pay it, it's going up $20,000 a day until you do. So he had to pay it. And plus. So it was quite corrupt. And but the people are lovely, and the actors are great. And of course the weather was fine for us as well. And Mexico City is a very interesting city.
John Glen, on behalf of For Bond Fans Only, can we just say thank you very much for taking the time out to speak to us today? Yeah,
it's been fascinating listening to you, and you're very well respected on the group. Everyone loves your films and the diversity of your films. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.